All right, what is going on, everybody? Welcome back to SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Thursday. It is September 1st, if you can believe it, of 2022 here. We are finally into September, which means we are a week away from football season starting up here next week, which I am so excited for here. August was pretty good to me, all things considered, in the MLB DFS streets. I was actually checking my results here earlier this morning, and it was just like big downswing all season, and then August just like shot back up. I feel like I realized all of my baseball EV all in 1 month. So glad to have done that at all, first of all, but getting a little tired of the high variance in baseball. I guess football is not necessarily the antidote to the variance problem. It is also a very high variance game. But anyway, I'm just very excited to watch some football. Can't believe we are a week away here right now from the first game of the season. What should be a pretty awesome showdown slate next week, Bills and Rams, and then obviously the NFL main slate coming up thereafter. So if this is your first time tuning into Office Hours, I know over the next week or so, we'll probably have a lot of new faces in here, a lot of people watching for the first time. So welcome. My name is Jordan. I am the head coach here at SaberSim. And on this show, I answer questions from our community about how to use SaberSim to build better DFS lineups. So if you have questions you would like me to answer, you can ask me live here. YouTube chat is a great way to do that. Our Office Hours channel in Slack is another very good way to do that. And if you catch the recording of this show, either on YouTube or in the podcast format, you can email us, support@sabersim.com. Ask your question via email, and then I'll cover it on the very next show. We have a interesting little split slate here today for baseball. We have 4 games now. I think that slate already started. There's like a 4-game slate going on right now, and then a 4-game main slate here later today. So kind of all over the place. There is a question about attacking 4-game slates, which we will get into here in a bit. But interesting little day of baseball. We'll go ahead. Let's just get started. I'm going to start just answering questions here in about the order that they came in here. Starting with a question that came in yesterday from KG and has 4 100 emojis as a response to it. So I guess there is some excitement about this particular question. Question says, can you demonstrate on today's stream on how to get an edge with stack exposures? I see SaberSim, the SaberSim All-Star team with the right combo stacks, using the default sliders from my contest, setting the exposures correctly on who I want to be over and under. I had very few of the Philadelphia and Boston combo in my 1,500 pool. What's the best practice in this situation to be spread out to all types of team combos? So I will say, first of all, right, and on a 4-game slate, it's probably a little bit more doable. But on a slate like we had last night, it's hard enough to get stack exposure to every team and get within those exposures, get like even exposures to all the different players on the team, all the different ways you could stack that up. When you add another variable of saying that you want even stack exposures to all combos, right? To every single, you're getting an even exposure to every single team combo, then it even gets harder, right? Like at the end of the day, you're not going to be able to get exposure everywhere, right? And that's not really the goal. And I think even you running, like there's enough variance between you running your build and me running my build of what those lineups are going to look like, that like it's not necessarily realistic to say that like the SaberSim approach was to get that like Philly and Boston together last night, right? Like I think I had one good Philly and Boston lineup stack last night in my portfolio of like 360 lineups on FanDuel that just so happened to end up in the perfect contest and just also happen to have the right players. So it's not, I don't want to necessarily give the impression that it's like, I don't know, that like you can realistically get exposure to every single stack combination on any given slate. With that said, I'll walk through a couple things that I typically like to look at here. And let's just assume, we're building 150 for tonight's slate, right? So I guess this will be an opportunity to talk a little bit of strategy as well, I guess, like 4-game slate strategy. But I'll tell you a little bit of like a few things that I'm looking for when I am kind of getting to my stack exposures or ending up with who I want to end up with here. So I'm going to let this full 1500 lineup build. But most of the time, like, first of all, one thing for my process, I'm not going through the trouble, I guess, of trying to like add additional value by changing the stack projections themselves, right? Like, I most of the time am going to generally trust the model. I'm not really trying to like, handicap the team totals and say like, oh, well, I actually think this team is projected for 0.5 more runs, or I'm trying to, I think this team is projected for 0.5 less runs. A lot of my process, and I've said this plenty of times here on this stream, is mostly trusting the model, like mostly leaving things where they're kind of at there, building a big pool of lineups from which to work from, right? My strong foundation. And then seeing if there are any additional ways that I can add some additional value here based on making this a better better adjusted for risk for me, for how I like to play. And also if there's any opportunities to maybe take a little bit of a leverage stand. And that's where I do get a little bit more creative. So if we can bump over to the teams here, right? So first of all, thinking about this from the risk management standpoint, I'll do this on the teams here today because I think this makes a little bit more intuitive sense to people, right? I will just go through and again, we're treating this portfolio here, 1500 lineups, as a viable subset of what makes sense for this slate, right? So these numbers can give you kind of a baseline of where you might want to be with your exposures, right? So I will start then to kind of look for, one, how does this match up with my risk and where are some opportunities to get some leverage? And the smaller the slate, this gets a little bit more into the smaller slate strategy. The more I'm a little bit interested in just starting to take some like leverage-based stance, right? Yesterday we had 9 games on the slate. Like I didn't really get to any Colorado. I didn't really get to any, wait, Colorado wasn't the team I was thinking of. I didn't play any Dodgers. I actually think there was maybe an argument to play Dodgers yesterday. I didn't really get to a lot of LA. I didn't really get to a ton of KC either, right? Because I didn't think you really needed to, right? But on a 4-game slate like tonight, you can even see it just expressed in the default sliders, right? Our need to think about ownership is a little bit higher. And this number is basically adjusted for that, right? Like, these are the stack pool exposures for a build built for this kind of contest, for what we feel like is kind of the optimal angle on a slate like this, right? So I will kind of start looking at this, one from a risk tolerance standpoint and two from a leverage standpoint. So I haven't even looked at the slate, so I'm kind of doing this on the fly here, but I'll want to get an idea of like where the chalk's going to be. So let me go look at chalk, like hitting chalk here first tonight. So Boston and Atlanta makes a lot of sense. Then probably secondarily Texas, right? So I don't need, on a 4-game slate, from my perspective, to find more reasons to play the teams that are already going to be chalky, right? Like, yeah, 40% of our lineup portfolio has Texas in there. 43% has Boston. 41% has Atlanta. I don't feel like I need to get over this number to get more lineups on the teams that are already going to be the chalkiest ones in the field. So I might start thinking about, kind of from a risk management and like leverage standpoint, I'm going to maybe match those numbers here a little bit, right? Why get more exposure to those teams that are already going to be super chalky? And there is a little bit of a reason here, at least based on our stack pool exposure, to play some of these leverage teams, right? On the pitchers, there are going to be so many Spencer Strider and Shane Bieber lineups, right? Like, chalk doesn't always mean the same thing, right? Like yesterday on a 9-game slate, we were like, oh, the pitching chalk is DeGrom and Cole and Lynn, right? And they were pitchers that were going to be, 35 to 50% owned ish, right? I think DeGrom ended up coming a little bit higher than we expected, but we had those guys at like 40% ish projected owned, right? They were the chalk last night, but that in just absolute value terms means something very different than 86% owned Spencer Strider and 55% owned Shane Bieber. And SaberSim is telling me, yeah, there's like viability to potentially getting a little bit of a fade on here. So I would probably do that, right? Kind of almost by the same coin of what we were saying before. I don't need additional reasons to play more chalk stacks, right? But I am happy to find reasons to play the leverage stacks here on a small slate like this here tonight, right? So I'll look, and that's also going to then start to balance out some of our pitcher exposure, right? That's going to get me off of some of those other chalky pitchers, right? So one other thing that I will kind of start to do as well is look at just individual batter exposures. I do this pretty much every time, right? And I want to see, because at the end of the day, we play we play players, right? Stacks are descriptive of lineups, but we play players, right? One thing I like to do is just to see, like what is the highest overall individual hitter exposed in my pool. And I typically want to make sure that my individual batter exposures are about in line with that, right? This actually looks like decent. I'm not too worried about this, but I might bring this down a little bit. I don't know if I need like 30% of anybody, right? Maybe bring this down a little bit to like 25%, right? So, I'm just, so that's one thing that annoys me sometimes is that 0 gets stuck there and it says like 250% instead of 25. So again, I'm just like kind of just bringing down, this is a pretty incremental change. This is kind of a minor thing, but I typically like to just bring down some of my top batter exposures a little bit here as well. Just to kind of match like the pool exposure, right? So, and that's kind of how I would like think about it here as just like a framework to get started on the slate here tonight. And I might even end up going further with this, right? Like if SaberSim is saying like 9% of like 9% of a random like viable pool here has Colorado, right? Like I might even get a little over on that, maybe 16, maybe 18% here, right? Because that is a team that I'm happy to find reasons to play, right? Especially on a 4-game slate. And even, maybe a little bit on Baltimore here. I might actually bump them up a little bit too, right? Kind of the other side of the coin here. I'm not looking for more reasons to get more on the chalk on a 4-game slate, but I am looking for more reasons to get onto other teams if SaberSim's giving me a reason to play them. Now, sometimes like there are slates, if let's say DeGrom was on this slate, right, playing against Colorado. You might get 0% or 1% Colorado, even on a 4-game slate with these sliders, right, in your stack pool exposure. So to me, that's a little bit more of an indication maybe that stack isn't as viable. Maybe that doesn't work as well. So from there, though, like one thing, I don't care really about my combinations, right? Like I think you have to decide. I know this question was more about combos, right? You have to decide eventually a point in the process where you are going to, I guess, kind of give up some control, right? Like SaberSim will basically meet you wherever you're at, right? Where if you have 1 minute to build lineups, SaberSim will build you a strong foundation that 100% is playable into your contests. If you have an hour of time to research the slate and prepare for the slate, there's a certain amount of things that you can do. And then there's a certain amount of things that you can spend more time on, right? Like we could look like, let's see what my Colorado stacks look like, right? Okay, so the most commonly paired team with my Colorado stacks is Baltimore, right? Like maybe I don't love that, right? That doesn't intuitively sound like the best thing that I would want to do there. But I would typically just accept that for me personally. Like maybe there's a way to go through and spot check those lineups a little bit more. And one thing that we could do if you had a lot of time and wanted to go in a little bit further here is you could. One thing we could do is we could say, take all of our Colorado and never pair and never pair with Baltimore, right? So let's pick all of our lineups that have both Colorado and Baltimore and just trash all of those. And actually, let's trash all of them from our pool, right? We can do that. And then fill back up to 150. And that actually maybe is not a bad idea, but it gets hard to kind of micromanage. It gets hard to kind of micromanage all of your lineups and all of your stack combinations like that and get everything still the way you want them to be, right? So I don't typically worry too much, I would say, about stack combos to that level of granularity. But I typically do spend a fair bit of time looking at either individual hitter exposures or stack exposures overall and look for either opportunities to manage my risk and make sure that I'm comfortable with the amount of lineups I'm investing to each, stack or player asset is kind of the way I like to think about it. Or especially as slates get smaller, where are some opportunities to directly leverage, right? Or where are some opportunities to fade some additional ownership? Like yesterday's slate, right? We can come back to yesterday. I wasn't getting exposure I wasn't directly leveraging against the chalkiest pitchers because there were ways to get off of the chalk, I feel like, just by playing other stacks, right? Like I didn't have to play the I didn't have to play the Dodgers or the Rockies with a 2.9 or a 3.1 implied run total when you had teams like the Diamondbacks or the Yankees or the A's even like getting quite a bit less ownership than the Braves chalk, right? So, and yesterday's, honestly, there wasn't a lot of hitting chalk on yesterday's slate. You could kind of play whoever you wanted, but that's kind of how I'm thinking about it there. So, anyway, let's move on from that question. If there's any follow-up there, or if I confused anybody with any part of that, just let me know. And we'll go from there. Quick question from JSJR said, will there be any other esports sims available for COD or Valorant? I think like long-term, yes. We'd like to have sims for contests that are up in the DraftKings lobby, like basically anything that's out there. Those are pretty small DFS markets overall. Not very big contests, not a lot of people playing them, to be honest. So I think it's a lower priority thing for us to add. But yeah, long-term, definitely the goal would be to support those. So, and then another question here from KG, and I see a bunch of questions coming in live in YouTube as well. We'll get to those here shortly. Gonna hit the questions that are in Slack first. So another one from KG. I rewatched the Office Hours where you explain your process when you took down the 25 cent. I noticed you only had one build that you ran. Do you wait until closer to lock before running your build, or was this just a convenience thing where you didn't have a lot of time before lock? I typically run one build before lock. The only exception will be, well, there's two exceptions. One is if I run another research build, right? Which I'll still mix in, on a slate like today, if you were playing today's 4-game slate, I think like today might be a good research build slate, just because again, like that winning lineups, especially in larger field stuff, are going to get closer to that optimal score, right? So I think the research build kind of makes a little bit more sense. You're going to have to get a little bit closer to the nuts to win the large field stuff on a 4-game slate. So on a slate like tonight, I might also do a research build mixed in there. The other exception would be if I am building my lineups and within that first build, I couldn't get everything I wanted to do, right? If I hit the exposure limit or something like that, to me, typically that's more of a message to like, whoa, like back off, like you're probably doing too much. But sometimes I will actually then go back through and do another build where I maybe carry over some min or max exposures or things like that. But for the most part, it's generally kind of one build where I do most of my work from within there. Let's hit this question as well from William here. And we kind of touched on a little bit of this in the first question. I said, how do you approach a small slate like tonight's 4-gamer? Does your contest selection differ greatly on a small slate? You do great work. Thanks. Thank you. Yeah, so we kind of touched on that already. So like on a smaller slate strategically, right? First of all, let me reset some of these exposures. I'm mentally kind of thinking more of like, okay, I'm going to probably fade ownership a little bit more aggressively, right? The chalk is going to condense more. I'm getting more relative value from fading ownership just because those chalky players appear in more lineups. Hang on, this is all whacked out here now. Let me reset this as well because I trashed those lineups and then fill up to 150. There we go. So I'm just getting more relative value by taking stands on chalk here, just because there's more absolute, there's more like lineups that include the chalkiest players. So I will be more intentional about trying to like fade ownership and even directly leveraged against it. Strategically is kind of the main difference there. I'll also say like, I would be more willing to, I would be more willing to get like further over the field on players I want to be over on, just because there's less players in the pool. Like if I did have a strong conviction about one team or another or something like that, I would be willing to get well over, right? That's why I was like saying, maybe I even like, maybe I'm getting to 20% Colorado stacks where like on a traditional slate, I might match this pool exposure a little bit more. I'm like willing to take that stand a little bit more just because there's less overall players out there. Right. And contest selection, I would say, probably doesn't differ too much. I would follow the DFS profit plan either way. I'd be, following that framework. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, that's up on our YouTube channel, right? I call this out pretty much once a stream here. The most important video on our YouTube channel is this one, our contest selection framework. I follow that regardless. I'm not differentiating significantly based on size of the slate. The one thing I am changing sometimes based on the size of the slate is the amount of money I'm investing into the slate. I think I'm better at larger slates. I also think smaller slates are higher variance. So I think the swings are a little bit more. I'm not playing the slate here tonight. So I guess full disclosure, I can't play DFS today. But if I were, I would probably play a little bit less than my typical allocation, just because, especially in the larger field stuff, I think just the variance is a little bit higher. It's easier to just lose hard here on a slate like this. So I would probably, that's one thing that I would do. I think that's one, just like a personal perceived difference in edge. I think I'm better at larger slates. And I think for everyone, the variance is a little bit higher on the smaller slates. So I'd probably maybe wager a little bit less tonight, but cool. Let's see. I'm going to jump over, hit these questions here in chat real quick. Eric said, when will SaberSim put out college football? So we don't have college football sims or projections right now. Cautiously optimistic that that's something we can support for next season. We do also have partnerships with some other sites, Run Pure, DFS Karma, True DFS, Full-Time Fantasy as well. We have a few partners that I think may have college football projections, and you can use SaberSim through those partners and pull in their projections. So that's something to check out there. But we don't have college football sims or projections at the moment. So Dante says, two-part question, NFL, MLB. If I have time, would building 1,500 lineups for a 3-max be overkill? Because I see most people notice 500 is fine. Probably. You probably don't need 1,500, right? I think the better question is, does your process require having 1,500 lineups to sort through to find 3? It probably doesn't, right? Even if you were diversifying those 3 lineups significantly, right? If you were saying, I don't want a single shared player between any of my 3 lineups, you probably still wouldn't need 1,500 lineups to do that. So it's probably overkill. I think 500 lineups probably is fine for most people to find 3. But there's not a significant trade-off either on the other side. 1,500 lineups takes a little bit longer to build than 500, but it's not way longer. So it's kind of up to you. It's mostly a time thing. And then Dante said, NFL, how can I force a run back of only a running back or a wide receiver from the opposing team? So that we would want to use a stacking rule. So we will create a stack. And this actually is likely to change here in the near future. We're rebuilding this part of the app, but it will change in a way that I think will make it even easier to use. So what we would do is we'll go to rules. I would recommend using an advanced stack here. I think they're easier. Even though it's called advanced, I think they're easier to use. And then what we'll say is on the primary team, we are going to say, you didn't specify here what the primary stack looks like, which is fine. So what we'll just do is we'll just say 1 quarterback, and then I'm going to assume you want maybe 2 wide receiver or tight ends, maybe 1 to 2, right? I know that's kind of common. So you want at least 1 up to 2 pass catchers, right? Here. And then you want either a running back or a wide receiver on the opposing team. So in that case, running back or wide receiver would be right here. So we'll say 1 running back there. And then every lineup we build here, we'll just quickly build a few of these, will be built with that construction. So we will always have a QB plus 1 to 2 pass catchers plus a run back on the opposing team. So I'm going to not build a full 500 here, but we'll build, say, 50 and see what these look like. So yeah, okay. Let me adjust to player projections so we can see the lineups. And then there we go. So yeah, we have mostly QB +2 with one run back, some QB +1 with one run back. But they always have the run back, which is the important part. And the run back is always a wide receiver or a running back. So Daniel Jones, Tony, Saquon, which I actually realized, this fits with Robert Woods on the other side, right? Hurts, Goddard, with St. Brown on the other side, Baker with CMC and Moore, with Amari Cooper on the other side. So there you go. And then also in NFL Showdown, is there a way to get a percentage of 5-1 stacks from a team, but also have a percentage of 4-2 stacks? Yes, you can do that as well. That is all handled within your, here, I'll just pull up one of these old builds for this one. That's all in your like team stacks section here. Oh gosh, what did I do with this? Sometimes I come back to these old builds and I have no idea what changed. Okay, so that would be all handled like within your teams here. So this is actually, you know what? Let's just build new lineups. This build is weird. Let's just build a new set of lineups. But anyway, it's in that team section. So you can control like not only how many 4 stacks or 5 stacks you have, but in this particular case, how many 4 stacks or 5 stacks of the Rams versus the Bills, or however you want those lineup constructions to work. So I actually typically end up doing some edits there, right? Like a lot of times I talk about trying to just get different here. Like I'll basically say I'm only going to play like 5 stacks of the underdog just as a way to get a little bit different. But yeah, if you want to control your Buffalo or Rams 5 stacks, or your Buffalo or Rams 4 stacks or whatever, you can do that in the teams tab here with these exposures. So Shadow says, should we trust the Sims as is? I feel like when I do that, I have a 50-50 shot of winning anything. What changes should I make to the lineups, if any? Yeah, I mean, good question. So I think the first valuable thing that I would recommend when you're thinking about your lineups overall, like your portfolio, when you're first getting started out, is your personal like risk tolerance, right? The foundation of lineups that you're getting are going to be very strong to begin with. There's opportunities to add value there, but I think the easiest thing to do when you're first starting out is making sure that your portfolio of lineups you take with you into your contests matches your personal appetite for risk on that slate, right? Like if we look at this build, right? Let's say you're playing the 4-game slate here tonight, right? If you just went in here and you go stock and you just kind of take these lineups as are, I would say these 150 lineups are probably going to be very good, strong lineups for this particular slate. Now, with that said, they are 100% full of all Spencer Strider and Shane Bieber, right? It's a 4-game slate where there are clearly, 2 pitchers projected far and away above the other options. Woodruff is close, but he is more expensive and projected for far less points, right? But it's baseball, right? Either of these guys can get lit up. Either of these guys can have a bad game. I think a better question of saying when you are first starting out is this good, right? Am I comfortable with the risk associated with this, right? That's a better first question. And there are ways to balance out that if the answer is no, right? I typically like to use the ownership projection and the pool exposure as kind of a baseline of how you might adjust that relative to your risk, right? This might be too risky for me, right? I might feel a little bit more comfortable matching either the ownership or the pool exposure and having, maybe 80% Strider and maybe 60% Bieber as a starting point here. And I think risk tolerance and kind of addressing your lineup portfolio for risk is one of the higher value things that you can do when you're first getting familiar with the tools, because everybody's appetite there is going to be a little bit different. The other thing I would mention, and I already called it out at the start of the stream, is from a contest selection standpoint, make sure that you are following a strong contest selection and bankroll management framework, right? It's not sexy. It's not that exciting, but you almost certainly, if you are not already following a good contest selection framework, that's probably the actual biggest change to your ROI that you can make, right? And there's a lot of bad contest selection advice out there. So before you're figuring out, what am I actually going to do to improve lineups, right? Figure out, am I playing the best contests that give me the best possible chance at success already? So that's where I would start. Now from there are strategic questions about, maybe ways that you could improve lineup quality, but they are incremental adjustments, and you're going to get less bang for your buck there, right? You're gonna have to put in more time to get a smaller result, because at that point you're talking about basically improving upon like things that SaberSim is already doing for you. Whereas by playing your lineups into the best contest as possible and matching your portfolio to your appropriate level of risk, you get a lot more out of that in a lot less time. So that's where I would start. But Dante says, when are the final sims typically run for NFL? Let's say I want to build Saturday night, unless there's some unexpected inactives, how much would change? Final sims run for NFL after inactives on Sunday morning. And then they'll typically be an alert in the channels in our Slack that say like, hey, sims are final. You could probably run lineups on Saturday night and get an idea of what the slate is looking like. And for something like week 1, where there's probably not likely to be a lot of surprise last minute news, that would probably be okay. But best practice, I think, would be to wait for the final inactive sims to run in the morning, which will also capture like final ownership and things like that, and then run your lineups. So I would say about an hour before lock is when I like start my NFL process. So Skull, this is a common question. He said, hey, Jordan, with more and more people coming to SaberSim, do you think we need to do a little more than before to get an edge / be different? I think it's easy to forget like what kind of bubble this ultimately really is. The DFS world is so much wider than you think, especially if you end up consuming like a lot of content and watching a lot of shows and reading a lot of articles. There's like, we have like SaberSim, right? That is just a very small subset of like all of the people that even use a DFS optimizer, right? Of all the people that even use a DFS optimizer, I mean, there's other subsets here, but that's only a subset of people that are even like doing research at all, or like even like really kind of trying to make an effort. And that's just a subset of the DFS community. And that doesn't even account for like the people that are actually using these tools correctly. So I don't think we're at that point by any means, personally, like where you actually like should be concerned about other SaberSim users consuming your EV in these contests, especially like with something like football coming up. It's such a small drop in the pond. So Shadowhawk said, thank you for the help. I'm new to DFS and SaberSim, so trying to learn as much as I can. Yeah. No, for sure. And I think it's like, so on other tools, right? If you started using another traditional optimizer and you're like, okay, what do I need to do to get started? You're going to hear from somebody that's like, oh, okay, great. Like, welcome. You need to go and set all of these rules. You need to program your optimizer to do this and that. And you need to think about ownership, and you need to think about correlation. And not every player is always going to score their average projection. Like there's all this stuff you're going to have to do. And the reason you have to do all that stuff is because the tool you're using with other optimizers out there doesn't know what a good lineup is on its own, right? All it is trying to do is optimize for the highest average projection of a player, but it doesn't take into account correlation and ownership and the real ranges of outcomes of players, right? SaberSim does. Is it perfect? No, we do not have a perfect 100% precise understanding of correlation. We don't have a perfect precise understanding of ownership or of the ranges of outcomes of players. But because we have the game sims that calculate these ranges of outcomes and quantify correlations between players, it would be better if I clicked on a batter here and quantify these correlations precisely, and then pull this data in automatically in your lineups. The lineups you are getting are so far and away better. They start you so far along in the process of what makes those lineups good that there is typically less that I can come up here and say that you should do to them to improve upon them than if you were using a traditional optimizer, which is why when most of the time new people come on to this stream and say, hey, Jordan, what can I do to improve my results? My first answer is, well, make sure that you are diversified in a way that works for you, because that answer is something that SaberSim just doesn't necessarily know, your personal appetite for risk. And make sure that you are playing your lineups into the best contest as possible, because that's also something that we can't do for you. Once you have that down, those two things down, and you have an understanding of what makes a good lineup, right? Which I think SaberSim will help explain to you as well. Then we can kind of start talking about the incremental improvements you can make to your lineups, right? I talk about often here on this stream builds I run that I call our research builds. And what those are essentially, I would say, intended to do is those are intended to provide incremental improvements to the way that I'm exploiting ownership on the slate. SaberSim is already accounting for ownership a bit in your line. Well, not even a bit. SaberSim is already accounting for ownership in your builds. A research build is a tool that I use to add an incremental improvement to squeeze out a little bit more juice there, right? You can do things like setting stacking rules or player groups or advanced stacking rules to add an incremental improvement to get your lineups to account for correlation a little bit better. You can adjust player projections or ownership projections or curate a player pool a little bit to incrementally improve the raw scoring upside of your lineups, right? But the foundation, what you should be starting with first, because SaberSim does such a good job of doing 80% of that legwork for you, is making sure that you are managing risk and contest selection as optimally as possible. So that's kind of the better answer, I think. That's the fuller answer to what I was trying to describe before, and why my answers are different. If you go to any other DFS stream, literally any other DFS stream on YouTube or whatever, and say, just trying out your optimizer for the first time, what should I do? You're going to get a very different answer, because those tools don't know how to solve some of the problems that SaberSim does by default. So anyway, Josh says, do you mind going over college football? Unfortunately, Josh, we don't have sims for college football, and I have never played a college football DFS slate. I don't know even where to start. I think it might be interesting, maybe once the NFL rush cools down a little bit, if we, Eric on the team does have a little bit of a better idea of how to beat college football DFS, and I'd be curious to hear his thoughts on, like, even without our sims, like with kind of just a decent set of other projections or something like that, like what maybe some steps are to build good lineups there. But I wouldn't even know where to start you there. I would say, it's probably follows pretty closely in terms of like overall DFS strategy from NFL, but yeah, I don't know. So DG says, every time I've looked in MLB, I'm tied with another SaberSim user. The lineups aren't even the same. Yeah, I mean, I think SaberSim outperforms its expectation in any given contest, right? Why are you seeing so many SaberSim users at the top? Well, it's a good thing, right? But I don't think they're cannibalizing. I don't think it's necessarily a cannibalizing EV situation there by any means, right? It's still, it is a big pond. So, all right, cool. There was a follow-up question from KG, which is the question we started with at the top. He said, I was kind of confused by the demonstration. Does that mean whatever is in your pool, you find ways to pull the best lineup up to the top? Okay, let me kind of think about a way to rephrase this. I don't know why I keep seeing this message. So, okay. So what I'm doing is, the first thing I'm doing here is making sure that my portfolio is in line with what I am comfortable with in terms of the overall exposure, right? Sometimes, like, so you're going to get, we're building 1,500 lineups here. In this case, we're selecting a subset of 150 out of that, right? So there's going to be a bit of a, like, condensing, I guess, of your exposures onto a few different plays, right? I typically, like, this is kind of just the way that I even like kind of think about DFS, but I generally believe that even on a 4-game slate, there are a lot of different ways to build positive EV lineups, right? There are a lot of different good lineup constructions. I am not a believer that there are like locks in most baseball slates, even 4-game slates, especially for hitters, right? So when I first kind of start my process, I'm letting the pool exposure for hitters or for stacks to kind of guide me to where the right amount of balanced exposure is for certain teams, right? Like if there is not a team that is showing up in more than 45% ish, there are not team stacks that are showing up in more than 45% of my total pool of 1500, right? Like to me, that's kind of almost like a ceiling of how exposed I want to be to any one given stack. Strategically, since this is a smaller slate, I will also start to think then about leverage, right? And ownership, and kind of think about how can I get, is there any way I can like directly leverage against ownership, right? So in this particular situation, my exposures have somewhat condensed onto about 50% Boston, which is more than I think the stack pool exposure is implying is appropriate for any given team. And they are the chalkiest team on the slate, right? I guess kind of tied with Atlanta, right? So like for those two teams, I'm particularly not looking for reasons to get additional exposure onto them. So I might then come in here and make that adjustment and say, maybe I want to be at 40%, but I could even go further, right? Like I know yesterday you had a question, how do I know what number to actually set this to, right? Maybe we could apply those concepts and say that I actually, based on my research, want to fade Boston even more, right? Like maybe who's pitching here? Let's look at the pitchers real quick, right? Okay, it's Glenn Otto. Not the best pitcher, but maybe for some reason you're like a little bit bullish on Glenn Otto, or you don't like Boston that much, right? We could even take this one step further and say, okay, I'm going to actually come down to half of this, right? Like I'm going to get to 22%, right? I'm taking a stand now in the opposite direction on that particular team, right? So I am kind of combining a risk tolerance decision of like how much exposure do I want to any one of these teams, right? I would probably also cap my exposure to Texas here, just because again, it's like I don't feel like I need to get that much leverage on it. I don't need to be over my stack pool exposure on a team like that, right? Along with a strategic ownership fade kind of decision of like why of 1,500 lineups that feature 1,500 lineups that are optimized for this contest, that are well built for this contest, why play the ones that feature why play a ton of the ones that feature the chalkiest team on the slate, right? That's kind of how I'm thinking about it when I can play all of these other ones, right? And that's part of that that's not just necessarily like an absolute law that I'm saying I do every single time, but because it's a 4-game slate, I'm especially paying extra attention to the ownership of those teams. So let me review this question again and see if I'm getting going the right direction here. Whatever is in my pool, I try to find ways to pull the best lineup to the top. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of how I'm thinking about it, is like, is there any reason that I have to believe that I can isolate some better lineups from the pool into my 150 beyond what just automatically showed up there via SaberScore, right? So I'm kind of saying all else being equal, right? Assuming that these 1,500 lineups are all kind of roughly similar. One thing that I think I might be able to do that pulls a little bit of additional value out for this particular slate is to fade some of the chalkier stacks, right? So I might do the same thing with Atlanta here, right? And maybe Texas, because I do think Texas is a chalkier stack. And get exposure to teams that I think are going to be a little bit less popular, right? And maybe that's fading. Maybe that's directly fading the pitching chalk. Maybe it isn't, right? Maybe this is enough. Maybe I want to actually get to some specific, maybe I specifically want to get to Baltimore or Colorado, right? It kind of depends. But Excuse me, 1 second. All right. Man, I said I was going to roster a Colorado stack and then I choked. So maybe that's not the play. All right. Woo. That's a bad omen for Colorado stacks, I'll tell you what. Just saying that I was going to roster Colorado against Strider, and I almost lose it. But anyway, any other questions here for me today? KG, is that helping a little bit? I think part of what is hard to describe about this particular step of the process is that it is somewhat slate dependent, and that it is also somewhat incremental, right? Like I think maybe it would be more helpful if I separated out these two things. So let me try that actually. So the first thing I would probably actually be doing if this was my true build, if this was me sitting down to actually build these lineups, is making sure that I wasn't like far overexposed to any team or player that I didn't think like had merit there. So I think this is actually how I would probably start, right? It seems like to me that any one hitter, right, the best possible hitter that you could roster in a lineup portfolio is some of these Braves and Boston guys at around 25% exposure. So I don't see a lot of reason to be over the field on any of these guys, right? Like why get more than 25% exposure to a hitter if the best possible hitter is in 25% of my lineups, right? This is a risk tolerance thing, first of all. So I want to be clear. This is about me managing my risk. I want a more diversified portfolio than I'm getting from SaberSim by default, right? So this is kind of step one. And that's kind of where I typically leave it for hitters. I might, though, for the purposes of demonstrating this, then also go look at stack exposure, right? And kind of similar thing here, right? Any given best case scenario stack is like 44% owned, right, in my pool. So maybe that's kind of my soft cap for any given stack, right? I don't need to be getting 50%, 60%. Sometimes this is more egregious. I'm getting a pretty balanced portfolio by default here, but sometimes this is worse, right? And I can actually go and then look at pitchers here as well. So interesting here on pitchers tonight, right? Or like this is interesting. And a lot of times the way I kind of think about this is as tiers, right? So we have a clear best overall tier with Spencer Strider, 80% of the lineups in our pool. And then a clear drop off to Shane Bieber, 51% of our lineups in our pool. And then it's kind of balanced from here on out, right? 22%, 17%, right? Like there's kind of it's a little bit more balanced here. I might also continue to diversify this a little bit further. And what I think I would probably do is say 80%, and 60% maybe here, but then no other pitcher over. Oops. All right. So good sign that I've gone too far. Let's do this. Let's actually just back off this. I think for this particular situation, I think I'd be okay, given that we just saw that message and given that it seems like there's two pitchers that are just so far and away better than the other options. I think I'm actually okay with this here. So I'd probably leave this here. Maybe we would do like 80% and 80%, right? But for example, for last night when I ran this process, I see what happened here. Why? Oh, okay, never mind. I'm just being dumb. So maybe 80% and 80%. Last night when I did this, like this same process was telling me that there were paths to playing pitchers that were not Cole, DeGrom, or Lynn. And I did that. And I don't think, like, in retrospect, that worked out very well, but this same process was leading me to diversify my pitchers quite a bit yesterday. And I actually posted it in the MLB channel yesterday saying that, I was about even at the field on all three of those guys. And I was over a lot of my lineups yesterday ended up being cheaper pitchers with really expensive kind of elite stacks, because that's where this process was taking me. So anyway, that is the starting point of how I would think about diversifying these lineups, right? This again, I want to be very clear. This isn't strategic at this point, right? Strategic meaning I don't think this is adding EV to my lineup portfolio. I am just making sure that my results are smoother than they might have been otherwise, right? I'm getting kind of a flatter, I'm getting more, a wider distribution of outcomes across all of this whole portfolio, because that's how I want to play. I want to be heavily diversified. So now I might start thinking about strategically, what do I want to do on this slate, right? And this is where it does require a little bit of your own input, right? Like, this is less about what are the steps you're doing to do this thing. This is more about, like, what are you trying to accomplish by doing these things? And on a 4-game slate for baseball, one of the things that I have learned after playing baseball DFS for years is that fading, you are going to get additional value out of fading ownership because of how much the chalk can tend to condense, right? So I might actually go ahead and then look here and see, like, where is the chalk on this particular slate, right? And when you start getting hitters that are showing up in 26, 30% of lineups, right? These could even actually really be higher, whose most common outcomes are 0 points, right? I think you start to stand to gain a big relative advantage by fading some of those players. And it looks like I just lost my camera, so I don't know. We'll turn that off. But I think you start to gain an additional relative advantage by fading those players, right? Last night on the 9-game slate, the highest owned hitter on our ownership projections was 15%, right? Same thing with pitchers, right? We're getting a lot more of a relative advantage on fading some of the chalk at pitcher, even though they are the best projected plays, because they're showing up at 83% of your lineups. So now I might start, one thing that I commonly do, especially on small slates here like this, is to try to squeeze out a little bit more, like, strategic juice out of my lineup portfolio by taking some of those stands, right? This is already adjusted for ownership, because ownership filters into SaberScore, and our default ownership value is set appropriately for what this contest would be. I think I can add a little bit of additional value here. So what I would probably end up doing then is maybe making some strategic stands to stand against this ownership, by maybe getting some direct leverage against the chalky pitchers, right? Now, getting direct, how much direct leverage to get against these chalky pitchers is appropriate? Well, I don't know, but a baseline would be that 9% of our lineups in our pool of 1,500 feature Colorado stacks already. So probably at least 9 seems to be a good starting point to be. How much exposure to the Orioles to directly fade against Bieber? Well, we had 18, 19% of Orioles stacks in our portfolio, maybe at least 20%, right? So now I'm ending up with a portfolio here that is managed according to my personal appetite for risk, and also makes a couple strategic decisions based on what I think is an edge on this slate, which is a strong stance in a contest type where ownership matters a lot, on a slate size where ownership matters a lot, against 2 players that are gaining a ton of ownership, right? That's kind of the walkthrough there. So that's how I'm thinking about it. But cool. Nipsey had a question here. And it says, outside of SaberScore, how do you know what's best? You know what, like, the honest answer is, I feel like the honest answer there is, like, if you don't have something to fill in that gap there, right, then SaberScore is best, right? Like, I'm in this example we just gave, I think I can do a little bit better than purely optimizing for SaberScore by choosing to get a little bit of direct leverage against chalky pitchers. From there, I'm letting SaberScore determine what the best lineups are, right? But there isn't necessarily, if I could just point to and say, like, oh, outside of SaberScore, do this, it would just be incorporated within the SaberScore. So once once you start saying outside of SaberScore, I think the things that you can be thinking about are, do your lineup exposures match your risk tolerance, right? I know I've said that like 40 times this stream, but is if SaberScore is telling you to play 100% Spencer Strider, are you comfortable with that, right? That's one thing that I think you can think about. And is there anything, are there any slate specific edges that you think are exploitable there for that particular slate, right? That's another thing. But if you don't know the answer to that question, you will probably be better off focusing more on fundamentals there and letting SaberScore fill in the gaps. So, Skull asked a good question. He said, but changing exposures also means that you're sacrificing the top EV lineups according to SaberScore or whatever you get just by pool. Yes. And the trade-off is I am saying that the difference in SaberScore between virtually the difference in EV between most of the lineups in the pool is so small that I am willing to sacrifice a minuscule amount of EV to diversify further, right? That is what I'm basically saying. In the case of me getting some leverage on these pitchers, I am saying I actually think this is more plus EV, right? I actually think, like, let's see. So let's just look at like one of these lineups that has a Baltimore stack in there, right? Do I have any like Baltimore? Do I have any? Okay, so I have one Baltimore 5 stack, right? So this lineup has a SaberScore of 94.5, right? It's lineup 589. And SaberSim says this lineup probably shouldn't be in your top 150. By upping my Baltimore stacks, I'm basically kind of making the claim that I think mostly because of ownership, that this lineup actually is one of the best 150 lineups I can play from my pool. And you can see that, I mean, a 94.5 is pretty, like, that's not very far off from 100, right? I mean, this is like, it's within the range of error, I think, of this measurement that I feel pretty comfortable doing that. And I generally think that any lineups in your pool can be thought of in that way, personally, right? Like I typically think about the pool as being viable. And I think it's a pretty safe assumption. Most of the work that we do to backtest our models and backtest our sliders and all that kind of stuff is done so basically to support that assumption, to support the idea that your pool of lineups can be thought of as use any of these, whatever you want to do, right? It's up to you. So I would say, like, to kind of cap off all of this discussion we've been having here today on what can you do in the post-build process, you almost can do anything because these lineups are built unopinionated of those changes, right? Like if you said, like, I want to completely, right? Like, let me reset all of my exposures, right? And, maybe you say, like, I want 100% Baltimore stacks, right? Like, you can even do that. That's an extremely risky approach. But what that's going to do is it's going to, again, sort through this pool of 1,500 and find out the best 150 that allows you to do that. Now, you couldn't get 100% exposure to Colorado, right? We don't have enough lineups in the pool, right? That's basically saying in that case, there aren't 100, like there probably aren't 150 good lineups that are Colorado stacks that you can play into this contest, right? But you could pretty safely, like, I don't want to say safely, this would be an incredibly risky strategy, right? But you can do this in a way that you are like sorting through this pool of lineups that was made agnostic to this stance, and they're like probably still good because the foundation is strong of those lineups. So Svada says, what sim precision are you using here? It's sim precision 8. It's the default for, so this entire build that we've been using for most of the stream here today is the default settings for a 150 max between 10 to 50K. So something like the flagship GPP is kind of what we're mimicking here. So Nipsey said, this is a good question as well. Don't you think just by matching the pool and ownership, you are not gaining enough leverage? Yeah, I mean, I think there's an argument to be made there. I would say the edge that you are getting, like one of the particular edges that you are getting, is from a lineup construction standpoint, right? I mean, there's a few. You're still getting an edge from the fact that you're using a very good model, right? Like, I think that's easy to overlook. And Matt mentioned that on yesterday's stream, right? There's still an edge from the fact that you're using a very good projection model, right? I mean, there's a pretty significant portion of the field probably building lineups that are not even using any projections at all. And there's a lot of people using bad models to build lineups, right? So that's an edge. You're getting an additional edge based on the roster construction, right? Like the correlation of your lineup, right? There's still an additional edge there, right? And I think even on exposures only tell one part of the story. You can match the field on every exposure in your portfolio and still build individual lineups that are well optimized to exploit ownership, because the combinations of players that are used on an individual lineup level, right, balance ownership well, right? Like this is a good example of that. This features a Boston stack. This features Shane Bieber and Spencer Strider, and because of the way that this lineup combines with a lower-owned Diamondback stack, this lineup probably still manages to exploit ownership well, right? I guess what I'm specifically saying there is that the individual combinations of players here, the likelihood of this lineup being a winning lineup in this GPP probably outweighs the likelihood of what would be what the implied probability of that lineup being the winning lineup is based on its ownership projections. That's what I mean when I say an individual lineup that's well balanced against ownership. So adjusting your exposures and saying, I'm going to go get 20% Baltimore stacks is kind of a blunt way to say I want my lineups to exploit ownership a little bit more, but it doesn't necessarily tell the story. And just because I am even with the field on Boston stacks or Strider or anything like that doesn't mean those individual lineups aren't well leveraged themselves. So but and then and Nipsey followed that up here and said, you've got to be able to accept a decent amount of risk to reap the rewards. Yeah, and that is where, I mean, if nothing else, I think from this stream, you should be building a sense of what your own personal risk tolerance is, right? I talk about I say that all the time, your own personal risk tolerance, right? It sounds like you are probably more risk tolerant than I am. I play in a generally risk-averse strategy, but that's also because I'm playing a larger portion of my bankroll every night, and a lot of times I'm playing 300 or 400 unique lineups, right? If I have 40% of Boston, that means a very different thing in the total number, the total financial investment and the total number of unique lineups that I have that feature that player, right? I can get 10% exposure to a team and have that mean something practical. If you're playing 20 lineups a night, 10% exposure is 2 lineups, right? I mean, it's doesn't mean much, right? So, but that will help. I think it's important to build out your own personal sense of what your risk tolerance is. So, DG says, if you mess with nothing, step 1, you're battling the variance of the 1500 lineup pool and the variance of trying to get the best ones in your lineup of the 1500. I think 5,000 is an underestimated improvement. I mean, yeah, I mean, we're excited for that to come out. Yeah, I mean, I think it'll be good. I will say, you know, like for all the people, I get a lot of times people build their 1500 lineup pool, they have their 150, and then they come on the office hours the next day and they're like, Jordan, lineups 851 was my highest scoring lineup. Why didn't I get that in my pool? How can I get that lineup more likely to be in my lineup set, right? That's going to happen even more with a larger pool because you have more lineups to work with, right? The probability of your best scoring lineup being in your set of 150 is going to go down the more lineups you have in your pool, which, yes, you have more lineups from which to work with and dial in exposures and set things and whatever. But that's going to happen more often. So, wow, I have spam in my chat here today. I don't think I've ever gotten spam. How about that? Anyway, DG said true, but ceiling is higher. Yeah, I mean, the idea that this is just like This is just a sample size thing. The idea that any given lineup in a pool of 5,000 lineups is going to outscore, or if you compare to a pool of 1,500 lineups versus a pool of 5,000 lineups, it's more likely that the highest scoring lineup is in the 5,000 lineup pool than the 1,500 lineup pool. That's true. But you still kind of have to isolate that lineup out. So, but yes, I mean, we're excited about 5,000 lineups too. So, anyway, School says, I thought about my own risk tolerance, and then I see top DFS pros playing like 85% of a single player in their 150 lineups. Yeah, and it depends on the sport and the contest and the player, right? Like, I mean, maybe there's probably a strong argument to just lock button Bieber and Strider tonight on a slate like this, right? Like, I wouldn't talk somebody out of that, right? I don't know if that's necessarily what I would end up doing. It might be. I don't know if that's like for sure the way I would tackle this particular slate, but I wouldn't necessarily talk somebody out of it. But overall, I think like I typically like to play pretty diversified portfolios, and I feel like it. I don't know, when I look at other lineups out there, I feel like there's a lot of risk associated with those portfolios and those exposures. And that's not saying that I'm not taking risks in my individual lineups, right? Like, my lineups, I think in general still are well built, and they balance these different factors appropriately. But across my entire portfolio, I don't like to take significant stands off of basically what is the market in the form of the ownership. So, but anyway, I think we'll go ahead. We will cap things off there for today. It was a good stream. I think a pretty heavy focus on adjustments in the post build phase, managing your own risk, and then also like finding strategic, exploitative edges here, especially on smaller slates. So good stream here today. I will be right back again tomorrow for Friday stream, 2:00 Eastern tomorrow. Enjoy the little 4-game slate here tonight. Good luck if you're playing the 4-game early slate as well. And I will see everybody tomorrow. Take care.